what's going on, guys? How you guys doing tonight? Hey, my name is Chris Torres. I am the associate middle school pastor here at Riverside. I get to work with Grant and Allie. I'm on a really cool team. I also get to help put together small groups. And I just want to give a shout out really quick to our small groups. We've had a phenomenal time this far, and so far what we did last weekend was 2 weekends ago, we had a pumpkin carving contest. And so I just want to give a quick shout out to the pumpkin princesses who won. Would you guys stand to your feet? Let's give them a round of applause. Way to go, guys. So we're in this series called Doors. We're in this series called Doors, and we've been talking about how the doors in our lives, we allow things into our lives, and we've been going through this series where we've been taking the things that are in our lives that we need to get rid of. We've talked about things like anger. We've talked about things like depression. We've talked about insecurity and unforgiveness. And tonight, we're going to talk about addiction. And I really want you guys to pay close attention because I think this might apply to you more than you think. So let me give you the quick dictionary definition of the word addiction. And it simply means to be enslaved to a habit. Now, when I say the word enslaved, what's the first word that comes to your mind? Slave. A slave, exactly. Well, in Moses' day, back when they were slaves of the Egyptians, basically, anything that the slave master told the slave to do, they had to do it. The slave master would tell a slave when to eat. He would tell him when to speak. He would tell him where he would live. He would tell him who his friends were. He would tell him what kind of job he would work, how much he would get paid. And it's the same thing with addiction. When it comes to addiction, addiction will decide where you work. It will decide how much you get paid. It'll decide who your friends are. It'll decide where you live and what kind of job you have. And so tonight, I'm going to explain that a little bit. But while I do, I want you to think about this. Think about this thing. Small things turn into big things. Can everybody say that with me? Small things turn into big things. You got it. Great audience. So my buddy Mario in LA, he was a gangster. He was on the streets, did time in prison, and I got to know him and got really close with him. And he's getting his life on track, both him and his wife, but they just had a little baby boy. They sent me pictures in the hospital, and I got to see this little baby boy. I'm talking like little baby boy. Like he's the size of a potato. Like he's tiny. He's tiny. And when I see these pictures of little baby boys, like it fascinates me. I'm not a chick, so I'm not like, oh, how cute. Like my mind starts thinking like really weird questions. Like it amazes me that I look at this little thing that's the size of my hand, and I'm like, one day, this little thing is gonna file his taxes. One day, this little thing is gonna have a driver's license. And then I get super fascinated, like I'll walk through Target and I'll look at the little clothes and I'll like hold the little pants up to myself. And I'm like, I used to fit in this. There was a time that I fit in this. And I was not cute. I was an ugly baby. Really, really ugly baby. And who would have thought that this little ugly baby would grow up to be a 6'3", handsome looking young man. I'm just kidding. But the point I'm trying to make is this, is that small things grow into big things. Now, my story took a little bit of a twist along the way. So I grew up just like you guys. I loved to play sports. I loved to hang out with my friends, ride bikes, tell stories, make myself look cooler than I actually was. And but by the time I hit middle school, I kind of was addicted to the way people thought about me. So I cared a little bit too much about people's opinion of who I was. And so naturally, when you're like that, you do things to impress people. So I was the kid that was always in trouble in class for making fun of the teacher or shooting rubber bands at girls. And I got myself into a lot of trouble. But by the time I was in 8th grade, I was already headed down a terrible path. I had stolen a car. I had stolen a car. I was smoking weed. I had gotten drunk. I know. But listen, it only got worse. It started by being addicted to how people thought about me, but it ended up going from the next thing to the next thing to the next thing. And by the time I was in high school, I was doing cocaine. I was selling drugs. In 11th grade, the federal marshals came to my classroom and pulled me out of class because I was part of a federal investigation. Now, if anybody didn't know me in school yet, they knew me after that point. Because when a bunch of guys in a brown uniform come with guns into your classroom to get you out, people know you. And from that point on, we began to sell drugs, and I would go down to Mexico, and we would get drugs and we would bring them back up here. Well, when I graduated, I was 18 years old. 2 months after I graduated, we went down to Mexico. And on the way back, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning. The driver dozed off and overcorrected the car. I was in the back seat. I didn't have a seatbelt on. I flew through the windshield. And I have a scar from this point of my head to here that I've had 6 reconstructive surgeries on to make it that small. It was like that. It ripped my face open. But not only that, as I was flying through the air, the car's last rollover rolled on top of my legs. So I ended up with the car on top of me. And my head ripped open. And you would think this would be enough to cause somebody to change. Not for me. It just made it easier. I didn't have to go to Mexico anymore. I now had doctors that would prescribe me enough drugs to make money and to get me high. And so I kept selling drugs. I had friends that started to rob people, so I started to rob people too. I got robbed, and I came to a point in my life where I was sitting there. I had just gotten robbed. My face had gotten busted open with a pistol, and I was sitting on a couch, and I looked back at my life, and I said, how on earth did I ever get to this point? How on earth did I ever get to this point? Because I never intended that. I was a good kid. But my story, you guys sit there and in the audience and you're like, ooh, ah. But the thing is I'm no different from you guys. I started off the same way you guys are right now. I was exactly the same. Just like you, I played sports. I love sports. I loved hanging out with good people. I was not a bad person. I made a bunch of bad decisions because I had no idea that it was going to take me down that road. Listen to what the Bible says, guys. When I say I'm no different from you, it's not just me saying that, it's God. Check this out. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says this, says the temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. They're no different. It's just small things eventually grow into big things. And so I'm willing to bet right now that I'm not the only person in this room that when I was in middle school probably cared a little bit too much about how people thought of me. I'm willing to bet I'm not the only person that's in this room that's like that. I'm willing to bet that I wasn't the only person that might have started telling lies to my mom and dad. I'm willing to bet I'm not the only person here that's done that. Or maybe there's some of you in this room that you spend way too much time on video games. You know what I'm talking about. Some of you guys are glued to that. Like your whole world would crash if your video game system went away. Some of you guys spend way too much time on your iPhone 6. Some of you take too many selfies. But here's the thing, maybe it's a little bit more serious. Maybe it's a little bit more serious. Maybe some of you are already looking at some things on the internet you know you shouldn't be. Maybe some of you are smoking cigarettes. Maybe some of you are smoking weed. I know, I can't rule that out. I know I was. Maybe some of you guys are stealing. Or you're beginning to deal with an eating disorder or cutting. This is what I want you guys to know, and what God wants you to know, is that it is best, whatever is going on in your life, no matter how big or how small or how little you think it is, to deal with it now. Check this out. James chapter 1, verse 14 says this, says, temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. Do you guys know what an avalanche is? Yeah? Pull up that picture. So, that's an avalanche. An avalanche will destroy everything in its path. And in a matter of seconds, it happens too. But what I want you to know is that an avalanche, how it starts when it's extremely small. It starts small. And this is how it starts. When the snow, you've got the solid foundation, you've got the mountain. When the snow slips or breaks away from the solid foundation, when the snow begins to break away, it's small. But in a matter of seconds, it falls down the mountain. And when it falls down the mountain, it grows. It grows and it grows and it grows. Some of the biggest avalanches ever recorded were up to 8 miles wide, traveling at 80 miles per hour down the mountain. Yes. So something small ended up looking like this, and it grows and it barrels down the mountain. And when it settles, after it's covered everything in its path, when it settles, it becomes as hard as concrete, making it, if you've been trapped in it, making it almost impossible to get out. And what I want you guys to know about addiction, it's the same thing, man. It starts like this. It starts when there's a break from the solid foundation. When we start separating ourselves from the solid foundations that we have in our life, when we break away from church, when we break away from healthy friends, when we break away from the things that our parents have taught us is wrong, when we begin to pull away from that, things start to go downhill. And the thing is, what a lot of people realize when they're 24 and they have their head split open from a gun, like I did, is you realize, how did this grow so quickly? How did this become so massive in my life? But when it settles, when addiction settles in, when it consumes everything in your life, it becomes very, very hard to get out. Very, very hard to get out. But there's hope. Because the rest of that verse that I shared in Corinthians 10:13 says God is faithful. That even though there's temptations in our life, God is faithful. And whenever we are tempted, He will offer us a way out. He will give us a way out. And He's doing that here tonight by allowing me to have this conversation with you. He's going to give you guys a way out. Because here's the thing, if we are aware that small things turn into big things, if ugly little babies turn into cute, handsome men, if a seed will grow into a tree, doesn't it make sense to take your grandma's little shovel and dig up the seed while it's in the soft soil before you have to chop down an entire tree that's grown roots in the ground? Yes. The answer is yes. It is easier to do that. So I'm going to give you guys 3 things that if you're dealing with addiction, that this is your way out. This is how God gets you out. And your addiction may not look like mine yet. Chances are it doesn't. But if you're looking at things you shouldn't, if you're dealing with eating disorders, if you're cutting, if you know people that are like this is how you get out. The first step is this. And this didn't come from no 12 step. This didn't come from any advice I looked up on the internet or I had to pick up at Living Free. I got this myself because I went through it. I've been through it myself. So the first thing you got to do if you're going through this in your life is you got to admit that you cannot do it without God. You cannot sit there and give your all and try your hardest. There's a lot of people that do, and they never ever get out. You cannot do it without God. 2 Chronicles 7:14 says, if my God, and this is God talking, he says, if my people would humble themselves and pray and seek my face, I would forgive them of their sins and restore their land. And if you want some restoration in your life, if you want God to restore some things back to the way they used to be, if you want to be that kid before you started stealing, before you started lying, before you started looking at things on the internet that you shouldn't, you have to pray and seek God. And the second thing is this, is you have to go to God. You have to go to God. It's not just enough to admit you need God. You got to go to him. So the same thing, if I'm sick, where do I got to go? To the doctor. Because the doctor is going to tell me what's wrong with me. And he's also going to tell me how I can be cured, how I can be healed. When it comes to God, we have to do the same thing. So how do we go to God? That's a good question because it's not like Jesus is hanging out on our back porch with our dog. So this is how you go to God. You pick up your word. You pick up his word and you read it until you realize, hey, this is what's wrong with me. And then God will tell you how to heal yourself. And the third thing is this, and this is the game changer, man. For some of you guys, you just got to get honest, man. You got to get honest. You got to admit to somebody. You got to tell somebody what you're going through. Because here's what I've learned, and this is what the Bible tells me is true, is that sin grows in darkness. It says the Word of God says that God is light, and in him is no darkness. So that tells me that if there's some hidden area in our life that we haven't exposed to the truth or to God or to somebody else, that it's growing. It's growing. And just like an avalanche, it's going to steamroll downhill until it consumes everything in your life. So for some of you, you just need to admit to somebody what you're going through. Let's bow our heads. I want to do something really quick. Let's all bow our heads, eyes down, eyes shut. You know, I know your addiction probably doesn't look like mine, but to me, it didn't look that way when I was young neither. And so if there's any of you, if you've been dealing, and this, look, everybody needs to keep their eyes closed and head down. If there's any of you that have been dealing with cutting, that have been dealing with an eating disorder, that have been dealing with even drugs, or with stealing, or lying, or even something as simple as people's opinion about you, would you just raise up your head and look at me really quick? You don't have to raise your hand, just look up at me. Thank you, thank you. Now, keep your head down, eyes closed. If you know somebody, so maybe it's not you that's dealing with the addiction, but maybe you know somebody, maybe your mom, your dad has been going through this. Maybe it's your brother, maybe it's your sister, and you sit there and you watch them every single day, and it breaks your heart to see them the way they are. Would you look up at me really quick? That's what I thought. So this is what we're going to do, guys. This is what we're going to do. And if you're not addicted to anything and you don't have anybody going through this, don't at all feel pressured to do what we're about to do. But here's the thing. Daniel's gonna do worship like he always does. You guys can look up at me now. Daniel's gonna play some worship here in just a second. And we normally come to the front. But this is what I'm gonna do something different. We're gonna start tonight by dealing with this. Because I was that kid. I ended up 24 with my head busted from a gun, addicted to drugs, and I hated my life. And I don't wanna see that happen to you. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna start tonight. If that was you that looked up at me because you were dealing with an addiction yourself, or if that was you that looked up at me because you're concerned about your family or your friends, I have all of the leaders standing in the back. Daniel's gonna play this song, and this is what I want us to do. I want us to go find a leader, and we're gonna circle up in a group, and we're just gonna pray. That leader of that, you don't have to pray, the leader of that group will pray. But they're gonna pray for your friends, they're gonna pray for your family, and they're gonna pray for you. So I'll be the first one to start as soon as Daniel sings. And I'm gonna go, because I know that I still have tons of friends and tons of family members that are really, really messed up, that I care about. So Daniel.